5 months, 30,000 Palestinians killed, and an Israeli prime minister whose only plan is to reoccupy Gaza indefinitely. This time, has the U.S. had enough?
There must be an immediate ceasefire for at least the next 6 weeks, which is what is currently on the table.
For the Biden administration, Vice President Kamala Harris calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza before welcoming Benjamin Netanyahu's main political rival, Benny Gantz, currently part of a national unity war cabinet back in Israel. He's also welcomed by the U.S. Secretary of State, the Senate Majority Leader. This as the U.S. starts airdrops for Gaza and ups the pressure. As for Netanyahu, who's critical of the red carpet rollout for Gantz, he's shrugging off the international community's fading support for Israel, instead playing on the support of far-right coalition partners and the nerves of mediators who don't want the Arab world to erupt when a month of prayer and fasting begin next week with Ramadan. The ball is in Hamas's court, says the U.S. president, when it comes to that ceasefire deal. How insulated, though, is Israeli public opinion from the damage done to the country's reputation by the killing of so many civilians, as last week's bloodbath at a food distribution convoy in Gaza City moved the needle. Over the past 5 months, we've often asked how to find the common ground that can end this nightmare, with both sides traumatized by October 7th and its aftermath. Who and how to break a deadlock that's both destructive and, say critics, self-destructive. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at an Israel that's under pressure. Joining us from London, former U.S. Defense Department advisor Yasmeen El-Gamal. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We welcome back from Tel Aviv analyst, pollster Mitchell Barak. How are you?
I'm doing well, but I am in Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
Capital of Israel.
Okay. Thanks for being with us. Gil Mehaley is the editor-in-chief of Causeur magazine. Good to see you.
Thank you. Same here.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, Benny Gantz doing the rounds in Washington, meeting Antony Blinken after his Monday sit-down with Kamala Harris. There he went in without the Israeli ambassador, the prime minister's way of saying that he doesn't approve of Gantz flying solo. Gantz, the former Army Chief of Staff, who has heard from his hosts variations of the theme that the U.S. Vice President put forth Sunday in a speech in Selma, Alabama.
And the Israeli government must do more to significantly increase the flow of aid. No excuses. They must open new border crossings. They must not impose any unnecessary restrictions on the delivery of aid.
Kamala Harris turning up the pressure ahead of Joe Biden, who spoke just a short while ago after landing in North Carolina to campaign on Super Tuesday.
The hostage deal is in the hands of Hamas right now. Okay. Because there's been an offer, a rational offer. The Israelis have agreed to it, and waiting to see what the Hamas does. There's got to be a ceasefire, because Ramadan, if we get into a circumstance where this continues through Ramadan, Israel and Jerusalem, it could be very, very dangerous. So we're trying hard for that ceasefire. I'm working with them very hard. We're going to get more. We must get more aid into Gaza. There's no excuses. None.
And how's your relationship with Netanyahu these days?
Like it's always been.
Sir?
Like it's always been.
Mr. President, what?
Like it's always been. Gil Mehaley, what does Joe Biden mean?
Actually, it's quite interesting, because what are the Americans saying? First of all, that ceasefire is not a definitive ending of the war. It's for 6 weeks. Kamala Harris said, ceasefire now. These are the magic words that people want to hear.
Because before they were talking about pauses.
She pauses for 6 weeks, which is the Israeli position. Then Biden says, there is a proposition on the table, and if there's no ceasefire, it's because Hamas is refusing. I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying this is the American proposition. But the music is, it's Israel's fault. Okay, so we are a bit lost here. if Hamas says yes now, there's no problem, okay? So I think that this is not the issue, actually. I think there's a problem, there's a political problem within the United States. And this is why when she said ceasefire, people started clapping their hands, because most of these people don't know about which river and which sea we are talking about. So once you say ceasefire, they are applauding.
In their defense, it's the first time that we've heard the Biden administration utter the word ceasefire. Up to now,
Yes,
they talked about truce, they talked about pauses.
It means that they think, and probably they are right, that most people are stupid. Because you said ceasefire, and then she explains what she means by ceasefire, but people stay with the word ceasefire, which means the end of the war now on Hamas conditions.
Okay,
and
but
then she says, and then the president says, and if there is no ceasefire, it's because of Hamas.
Okay.
So what does it mean?
That reporter asks, you heard it, asks Joe Biden, how are your relations with Benjamin Netanyahu? He responds, like they've always been, with a smile.
Which means it's very bad.
Right.
As bad as it was.
How do you interpret, Jasmine El-Gamal, what we heard from the U.S. Vice President and from the President?
Yeah, look, first of all, I would vehemently disagree with the characterization that most people are stupid. Most people are not stupid. Most people are trying to get to an end to this horrific war. And so when people were cheering after Kamala Harris said ceasefire, of course, they heard afterwards that the ceasefire was going to be 6 weeks. People who are following this discussion know that what is on the table right now is not a permanent ceasefire, but it is a phased sort of negotiation. And the first phase includes a temporary halt in hostilities to get life-saving humanitarian assistance in and to get the hostages out and to be reunited with their families. And so that's what people were cheering for. And that's what everybody would like to see on the table. Now, what Vice President Harris said, it was for sure the strongest terminology and the most empathetic tone that she has taken, that anybody really from the Biden administration has taken since the beginning of this war towards the situation in Gaza, towards the Palestinians. She spent several minutes talking about Palestinians who are starving, who have to eat animal feed in order to survive, who are being met by gunfire when they try to get humanitarian aid from aid distribution points. We haven't really seen that type of language from the Biden administration before. So I thought that was a positive thing because it balances the empathy on both sides and really gets people to understand that these are two different traumatized peoples, you know, both Israelis and Palestinians that have been through immense trauma and that need to see an end to this war so that they can both go on rebuilding their lives. Specifically, and most importantly, right now, you have not only the hostages who are reportedly, I don't want to say large numbers, but, you know, Hamas said something about 70 hostages who may be dead at this point. I mean, that is just a tragic figure. And at the same time, you now have between 10 and 15 Palestinian children who have actually died of malnutrition and of dehydration. So it's a horrific situation. You know, the president and the vice president are right to increase the pressure rhetorically. And again, in conversations with Benny Gantz, we can talk about that in a few minutes about his visit, to really put their foot down and say enough is enough. We need a ceasefire now. The last thing I'll just say is that I also don't think that many people or most people are blaming Israel alone for the lack of a ceasefire. Hamas is demanding something very maximalist right now, especially in the first phase of these negotiations, which is a full Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. That's never going to happen, especially not in the first phase of the negotiations. So Hamas also, of course, bears a lot of blame for the fact that we haven't gotten to a ceasefire yet.
We're pleased to welcome Tahani Mustafa, senior Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. The Biden administration hinting that it could happen in a matter of days. It better what? Ramadan begins March 10th or 11th, depending on where you are. So next week, effectively. Do you agree with what you just heard from Jasmine, that we're still in the beginning phases of the negotiation?
I mean, it's hard to see how we're in the beginning phases of the negotiation if we've got the US and Israel refusing to actually engage with Hamas in these negotiations. It's not entirely illegitimate what Hamas is demanding here, which is a total cessation of hostilities in exchange of prisoners and withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and an end to the blockade. Now, Hamas has offered numerous offers on the table in the past for much less, and Israel has rejected all of those. The last one that Hamas tried to offer was a pause. It wasn't even a total cessation of hostilities. It was a 135-day pause, which Israel simply refused. And we've seen even now, I mean, even with this unilateral process of a kind of ceasefire, a negotiation process going on between the US and Israel, we saw Israel just last week almost torpedo that entire process when we saw them. When we saw the killings of a group of people in the north trying to access aid.
And in the last minutes, a Hamas representative has been quoted by the French news agency AFP as saying the path of negotiations, quote, will not be open indefinitely. Is that maximalist grandstanding?
I mean, there's always a form of public posturing. Israel is equally guilty of doing that as well. But as I said, given the context now, in light of the killing of 104 Palestinians in the north that were trying to access aid, and the injury of something like 400, it's difficult for Hamas to now try and accept anything less than what it has insisted upon in the past. As I said, this was a unilateral process between the US and Israel. There was absolutely no engagement with Hamas. And then Israel managed to torpedo that entire process. So, it is a form of public posturing at this point in time. It's very difficult for them, given what we have just seen come out of, especially the north of Gaza. And as was just mentioned, the fact that we're now seeing something like 10 to 15 children already that have died of malnutrition and starvation, and to simply cede over to the demands that Israel is making is, it puts them in quite a bind.
Since last Thursday's bloodbath in Gaza, the U.S. has joined nations now that carry out humanitarian aid drops there. These images filmed this Tuesday from southern Israel, looking across the border. What happened last week, Mitchell Barak, whether or not the Israeli Defense Forces account or the Palestinian account is the correct one, some likening it to what happened in 1996 in Lebanon, where the killing of civilians basically called time on the Israeli offensive there. Is this going to be one of those moments that moves the needle?
I don't think so, because I don't think it's clear that Israel is the one that is responsible for killing all those people. The Hamas is the one who's, taking over these trucks. There's like 200 trucks a day that are coming from Israel. Are there other countries in the world where the enemy is actually, providing the humanitarian aid to the people they're fighting? I don't know of such a case. And why is it Israel's responsibility to let that in? I mean, Israel has been asked by the United States to do it. And we've put soldiers at risk, people at risk in order to do that. We've all seen the videos of what happens when the trucks get in and the Hamas starts to control where that humanitarian aid goes. It's not the most efficient way to do it, and it's not very popular among the Israeli public. The Israeli public has said that the government promised from the beginning there'd be no humanitarian aid or fuel going in until we get the hostages or even information about the hostages. I don't know what this talk is about, Israel not negotiating. Israel wants not even a list of who the hostages are that are alive. They want the number, and Hamas is refusing that. Sinwar has disappeared for weeks on end. Israel has sent delegations to Cairo and elsewhere. And the U.S. and Israel is very engaged in doing this. If Hamas is not going to make reasonable demands for the release of the hostages, then it's just going to continue. Because at the end of the day, Israel, is pretty much united in this. Israelis want the hostages back, but they want to get rid of Hamas, meaning Hamas is a real threat to Israel, something that was underestimated. And the senior leadership, many of them are still alive in tunnels. And every day we discover a new set of tunnels and a new set of bunkers. And it's dangerous to the future of Israel. So whereas the pictures seem very terrible, I would really want to pose the question to the Hamas leadership, both in Qatar and of Sinwar, what's holding them back? Why are they keep going under this devastation, destruction, hunger, and death? What are they hoping to gain by this? I haven't understood that.
Well, you talk about the Hamas leadership, but what the international community is focusing on is civilians, especially with the high number of women and children who've been killed. You just heard a minute ago Tahani mentioning cases of malnutrition and some even say starvation. There was a front page column in today's edition of Haaretz, the Israeli daily newspaper. Amos Harel, the columnist, wondered if Israelis realized how much their allies' patience is wearing thin. The incident shocked the world, but in Israel it was looked upon with indifference. Whether or not, again, Mitchell Barak, whether or not the Israeli version of what happened is true, it happened on Israel's watch in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, again, the fact about indifference, the Israelis are concerned with civilian casualties. Everyone quotes that number of 30,000 Palestinians killed, but I've yet to hear anyone tell us how many Hamas terrorists are in that 30,000. Is it 8,000, 10,000, 12,000? Yes, there are civilians that are being killed, and it's a tragedy. At the end of the day, those tunnels are under those homes, and those tunnels are under those schools and under those mosques and everywhere else. And Israel has to go in with ground troops.
Let me put the question to you differently. How much reporting do you see when you turn on the news right now in Israel about Palestinian suffering?
I read Haaretz, so I see it all the time.
But not on the TV news.
Are exposed to it. You do see it on the TV news, but you also have to understand is we've been through a trauma on October 7th, and we are living this trauma every day. We are living this trauma every day, and we are working for our side and concerned for the casualties and the people that are killed and wounded on the Israeli side. And there are many, and every day there are more and more funerals, and every day there are more and more soldiers and people and civilians even being brought to the hospital, some even from the north, some even from terror on the West Bank. And so we're dealing with our suffering and our tragedy. So yes, we are aware of what's going on. And yes, Israelis are concerned. Israelis don't want to be in Gaza. They don't want to be it. We'd like the hostages back. And if the hostages would come back, it would be very, very difficult for Israel to continue this. But I don't see Hamas or anyone else really putting pressure on Hamas to give the hostages back and end the war. It's very simple. It could end really, really quickly if they would stop doing that. I think there are a lot of Palestinians that suffer at the hands of this Hamas government, which has been in since Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in the early 2000s. This is what they built for themselves there.
Jasmine El-Gamal, I ask the question again, the chances of this truce happening, listening to Mitchell Barak.
I think, first of all, there were several mischaracterizations in what Mr. Barak was saying that I think we need to clarify before we get going with the rest of the conversation, because it is just a basic fact that Israel is obligated under international law to allow not just the bare minimum of humanitarian assistance into the Gaza Strip, but the level of humanitarian assistance that was going into Gaza before October 7th, if not more, because now more people are in need and more people are on the brink of starvation. Now, it's not my opinion when I say this. Every aid organization that's on the ground, CNN International did an in-depth investigation speaking to representatives of those aid organizations who are describing in detail the level of bottlenecks and bureaucracy and paperwork that the Israelis are imposing on these aid. There are hundreds of aid trucks on the borders of Gaza that aren't being allowed to go in. The Secretary General of the NRC, Jan Egeland, showed a video of miles of trucks on the border, and you hear about some of the reasons. Traditionally, or basically the rule of thumb for the Israelis is that they don't let anything in that could have dual use purposes, that could potentially be used by Hamas for nefarious purposes. And that's fair enough. But you have reports now, again, from people on the ground responsible for these supplies who are saying that things like sleeping bags are not being allowed in because they have zippers on them, or something, whether it's toys, whether it's food, that is not being allowed in because it was in a wooden box versus a cardboard box. I mean, come on, we're talking now about even the vice president said in her speech, which was directly refutes what Israeli officials and what Mr. Barak was just saying right now. She said that the Israelis must do more. They must stop unnecessarily stopping this aid from getting in. This is not a secret. And when it comes to the massacre that happened when people were trying to get assistance, first of all, let's all be human here. The reason people are swarming these trucks is because they've been starving for the last 5 months. It's not all Hamas's fault. Hamas is not, we all have to agree on the basic culpability of Hamas in this situation. But when you go in and when the interim head of the hospital that these injured and people who have died went to, when he says that 80% of victims that came into that hospital, 147 people had bullet wounds in them. This is not just Hamas, doing whatever. We have to be able to agree on the culpability of the different actors in this conflict in order to move forward. And we also have to agree and understand that Israel is responsible under international law for making sure that the people it has occupied and the people that it is responsible for entry coming in and out of the country, airspace, maritime space, it is responsible for them not dying en masse. Let's just agree to that.
All right, we're having this discussion on what is in the United States Super Tuesday. 1/3 of the electorate called to the polls in 16 states for Democratic and Republican primaries. If the U.S. patience is beginning to wear thin, it's also because Democratic voters' patience is wearing thin with the Biden administration. After Joe Biden's run-in with Arab American voters in Michigan, another swing state on the ballot today, North Carolina, as part of that Super Tuesday primary voting.
We already have 30,000 dead people and 13,000 dead children, and all with the aid of Joe Biden. So for me, it's a red line that I just can't get myself behind.
Gilma Haley, just days after October 7th, in fact, it was the Monday after October 7th, you were in this very studio with us, and you predicted that this would go on, and at one point it would be the United States that would call time on things. Have we reached that point?
No, but we're not far. The main fact, everything else, everything apart this fact is interpretation. Joe Biden said that there is a reasonable proposition on the table, and Hamas refuses. This is the only fact. Everything else is just commentary. So the unique responsibility now is Hamas, and I don't see why Israel is taking the heat. If the United States thinks that Israel accepted a reasonable proposition, that Hamas refuses, and that all this suffering is continuing because Hamas is refusing, I don't understand what we are talking about. We can analyze the past, but today everything could end this night or tomorrow morning. What's happening is that there is a hostage problem. And it's not only the problem of the Israeli hostages. The main weapon of Hamas is 2 million Palestinian hostages. They do everything in their power to increase the number of deaths among this population and the suffering. And then in Israel, there's a joke about the killer that tells the judge, the guy who killed his parents, and tells the judge, please spare me, I'm an orphan. So they go to the international community and say, please help us, we are orphans. They do everything, they said, they don't care about their population. They have hundreds, they have dozens of kilometers of in the Ukraine,
right.
They have schools in the underground. And the underground in Gaza, I think, is more developed than in Kiev. It didn't cross their minds that they could put people there.
Right.
Of course not, because there will be less death.
Okay, total elimination of Hamas. That's what Netanyahu says.
Yes.
Remains the war effort.
Yes.
And you have said yourself that is an impossible
It's
goal.
impossible.
Right, and yet we saw it this Tuesday. The Israeli Defense Forces putting out this video of a tunnel, and this is our army handout images broadcast of a large tunnel found and destroyed near Beit Hanun in northern Gaza. And then filling it with cement. If they're only doing a little bit of it, it means Benjamin Netanyahu has to have a plan B at this point. And yet he hasn't formulated one.
No, Netanyahu doesn't have a plan B. I think Netanyahu works in two time spaces. Tomorrow morning and in 1,000 years. Tomorrow morning, he will be still in the government. He will maneuver. I've been here in 2009, where everyone agreed that it will be impossible to resist the pressure from the Obama administration and that we'll have to freeze the settlement activity. 15 years later, Obama is preparing a series for Netflix, and Netanyahu is still prime minister. So he's maneuvering. If he has the capacity to maneuver in Israel, it is because for the Israeli voters, the retreat in 2000 from Lebanon, the evacuation of Gaza in 2005, without a blockade, and even if there was no agreement with the Palestinian Authority, it's Mahmoud Dahlan who was running the place for 10 months without an agreement. So actually, de facto, Gaza was run by the Palestinian Authority until the first attack by Hamas in June 2006, where the Soldat Shalit was taken hostage, and then Hezbollah joined in. And so they killed that initiative, which was imperfect. I totally agree. But from an imperfect peace initiative, in order to revive the Oslo process, to go to a platform of armed combat against Israel without a political option, because this is the problem with Hamas. And then in 2008, Olmert makes a very good proposition to Mahmoud Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas doesn't give an answer because he thinks that the Israeli government is too weak. And then the Israelis said, okay, it's impossible, so maybe Netanyahu has a solution. So this is where we are today.
Right.
And all those who are talking about the day after and the two-state solution, okay, but it's an 80-years-old debate. And before we understand why it failed before, I don't see how we can expect that it will work tomorrow.
Well, the Prime Minister certainly is not ready to leave his post. He insists the war will continue until total elimination of Hamas, and that as long as the war continues, don't count on a snap election.
General elections during the war means a defeat for Israel. This is exactly Sinwar's dream. This is exactly Nasrallah's dream. This is exactly Iran's dream.
So that's the rhetoric from Benjamin Netanyahu. Mitchell Barak, enter Benny Gantz. What's he doing in Washington?
Well, he's playing by Netanyahu's rule book, which is chaos in the cabinet. Meaning Netanyahu has these two right-wing cabinet ministers, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. They say and do what they want. He enjoys the chaos, lets them, run wild with some of their policies when it comes to settlements in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria at this point. And he decided that it's time to go to Washington without Netanyahu and without his permission. So he's found that he's got a pretty good reception there, and that he's driving a wedge almost between the U.S. administration and Netanyahu, a wedge that is already there. And as Joe Biden says, his relationship with Netanyahu in the beginning is, as it always was, not very good. I mean, when he was senator, it was probably very good. When he was Obama's vice president, it wasn't good at all, because Netanyahu does what he wants to do. And he doesn't really empathize, and he's not sensitive to the needs of the Biden administration, which has gone out on a limb, which has saved Israel, which has provided moral, military, emotional, and global support to the Israeli people for eradicating Hamas and getting the hostages back. He himself has worked countless hours, as well as put his national security advisor and head of the CIA on this particular issue. The amount of time and energy and money that he and the people in the United States have invested in this is unbelievable. And you would think Netanyahu would cut him a break at some point and say, I get it, you're going through an election. Okay, what do you need? But Netanyahu is full steam ahead, because for Netanyahu, it's a lot about the internal politics and staying in and defeating the Hamas, which is what he says to do. And I agree with what was said earlier. It's impossible to totally eradicate Hamas, especially because we're going to replenish their fighters by letting out terrorists for our hostages.
Jasmine El-Kamal, your thoughts on Benny Gantz's visit to Washington?
I think the reception that Gantz is getting in Washington is definitely a big slap in the face to Netanyahu, and it's a real warning by the Biden administration to Netanyahu that they've had it with him, that they are starting to look forward. It is no secret in Washington or outside Washington that the Biden administration would love to see Netanyahu go. I mean, he is not a partner for peace. I wish everyone would just say clearly that Netanyahu is as much of a problem to peace as Hamas is. And what needs to happen after this war is both Hamas and Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben Gvir, and extremists on both sides of the border to just be gone, because they are impediments to peace. And so the Biden administration knows this. They are not. They are wise to Netanyahu's ways. Biden has been dealing with Netanyahu for decades. He knows exactly who he is. He knows that he's only he has one goal in mind, which is his own political survival. Netanyahu doesn't care about Israelis, just like Hamas doesn't care about Palestinians, right? They're two sides of the same coin. And so what the Biden administration wants to do is send a very clear signal to Netanyahu that they want to deal with a constructive partner. Benny Gantz has been, back when I was at the Pentagon, we used to deal with him. He is someone who is well-liked. He is someone who is respected. He's someone who is thought of as a pragmatic person. And so I think these talks were just a way of sort of setting the scene for what cooperation and what conversations might look like in a post-Netanyahu era.
I totally agree.
Tahani Mustafa, do you totally agree?
I mean, look, I think we have to be clear here. Yes, Netanyahu has been an impediment, absolutely. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that his career does ride on this war. And as long as that is the case, we will see this, it has already ultimately turned into a war of attrition. But, I think we have to be really careful about some of the reductive comments coming out of this debate here in terms of the idea that, we should, when thinking about the day after, we have to learn from the mistakes of the past. That's completely true. But here's the mistake of the past. The Oslo Accords, even in territories where the PA supposedly has full control, they are not fully sovereign territories under PA control. Israel has reserved the right for itself to conduct search and arrest operations, raids, targeted assassinations. We've seen that over the last 5 months, where Israel has gone into the PA's administrative capital and conducted raids and assassinations. We have seen, despite the fact that Mahmoud Abbas came out and condemned Hamas, condemned armed resistance, despite the fact that he has been the most conciliatory leader in the history of the Palestinian national movement, his reward for those statements on the 8th of October that he later had to retract was the withholding of tax revenues at a time when the PA is undergoing the worst economic crisis. So that's where conciliatory politics for many Palestinians, or at least that's what many Palestinians see.
So Tahani, what do you make then of Benny Gantz and that visit to Washington?
I mean, it's difficult. As I said, it's difficult to expect much to come out of this visit from Washington. It really is. I think from the Palestinian perspective, this really doesn't bring any serious, tangible changes.
Last week, the New York Times chief foreign affairs columnist, Tom Friedman, warned that Israel was losing the battle of public opinion. The article entitled, Israel's Losing Its Greatest Asset, Acceptance. It is losing the global narrative that is fighting a just war. It has no plan to ever get out of Gaza, so it will eventually sink into the sands there with a permanent occupation that will surely complicate relations with all its Arab allies and friends across the globe. Gil Mihaly, is he correct?
Yes, I think he's correct. We can see that. We can see that the support to Israel in the United States, one, it used to be a national issue. Now it's a party issue. And we see that the basis for support is approximately the Bible Belt, the evangelistic, and in the democratic part of the public opinion and in the youth, Israel is losing. We can see what's happening in campuses, but also during the caucuses and the primaries. This is a very...
So there's a generation gap when it comes...
There's a generation gap, there's a cultural gap, there's a geographic gap. Israel still have a very strong basis, but because one of the most, let's say that the nuclear engine of Zionism is Christian Zionism. First of all, in Britain in the 19th century, then in the United States. And this is still very, very strong. And it's not only strong, it's probably one of the important powers of the future. If you see what's happening in Brazil or in Argentina, evangelistic Christianism is a growing power. But it is a very problematic political base, very, very problematic. But if we see things as they are, Israel has that base that will be difficult to lose, and it's losing almost everything on all the other fronts, which is a very, very difficult thing. And then, of course, there are the Arab countries. Even if there's a peace between governments and a very good understanding between the king in Amman and the president in Cairo, there are public opinions, intellectuals, civil society circles, which do not accept Israel even when things are good and reject Israel when things are not good. And all these governments will be in a big difficulty continuing normalization in Israel against the public opinions. So Friedman is right, and it's a huge problem, and it's one of the things that Israel should deal with as soon as this war is over.
As soon as the war is over. Tahani Mustafa, we heard at the outset of the program the U.S. president urging this ceasefire agreement before Ramadan. What happens if there is no deal by Ramadan?
Well, we can only expect the situation to get worse, and given that we know Israel often tends to create provocations in East Jerusalem, I think that really could seriously escalate things. I mean, we already saw those scenes last year. We saw them the year before, May 2021. The last cross-border skirmish between Israel and Hamas was to do with events in East Jerusalem. And if this war if we don't see a ceasefire, if we don't see a pause, and we start to also see provocations elsewhere, which is what we are already seeing, by the way, in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank. Unfortunately, attention has been drawn to Gaza, where a lot of the uptick in violence in these areas is not being reported on. So I think we can expect things to get much worse, not only in Gaza, but across the occupied territories.
Israel saying it's going to allow worshippers access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan.
That doesn't guarantee the lack of provocations. Again, they allowed access last year, but still we saw incredibly violent scenes coming out on some of the most holiest nights during Ramadan. Laylat al-Qadr, the 27th night, was a really good example of that, where we actually saw Israeli forces going into the mosque and desecrating a holy site.
Jasmine El-Gamal, what will be the impact around the world?
The impact of...
If they're still fighting during Ramadan?
I mean, I agree with what Tahani said. I mean, the reason why President Biden and all of the mediators, actually, including Qatar, including Egypt, of course, are so eager to get to a deal before Ramadan is precisely what Tahani was saying. I mean, this is, of course, the holiest month of the year for Muslims. There have traditionally been provocations in the past, and the last thing that this situation needs right now is any added tension. And so the need to get to that point before Ramadan and just have a bit of respite for people, for people in this holy month to not be bombarded day in and day out. It is incredibly crucial. And of course, to have the hostages go home as well. And in terms of implications of other things that we've talked about, also, I have to agree with Gil, I'm sorry, that the mindset, this idea of the acceptance of Israel around the world, right? Israel today, in the minds of so many people around the world, is not the same Israel that Joe Biden has in his head and holds in his heart. It's what people are seeing right now, and you go on any TikTok, Instagram, social media, and this is not a point to be sort of poo-pooed, because this is the method of communication for the younger generation now, whether we like it or not. The Israel that they are seeing on those screens is an occupier. They're seeing IDF soldiers go into mosques in Gaza, take off their shoes and start saying Hebrew prayers on the loudspeaker. They see IDF soldiers rifling through women's underwear drawers and wearing that underwear and posting it on TikTok. I don't like seeing that stuff. I wish we weren't seeing that stuff, but I'm sorry if this is an inconvenient fact. This is the image of Israel that the younger generation is now seeing around the world. And no matter how many normalization deals are inked between political leaders, we have populations that don't accept each other anymore. Neither Israelis accepting Palestinians, nor Arabs accepting Israelis. And that is a huge problem.
The U.S. State Department spokesperson in the last hour saying obstacles to a Gaza ceasefire are not insurmountable. I guess that's the glass half full, Mitchell Barakalo. When you employ the double negative, obstacles are not insurmountable. It's not that great. Again, it's this idea of echo chambers that never connect. How do you break through and find the common ground?
Well, I'm hearing a lot of echo chambers here on the program, meaning I heard from two guests that it's going to be Israel's fault whether there's violence during Ramadan. I've never heard anything so ridiculous, meaning Sinwar has already come out, we've heard, and said that it's time to ignite the whole region. There are religious figures in Iran that say, hey, now is the time for Lebanon to get involved too during Ramadan. So Ramadan is a peaceful holiday.
But we're also seeing the Qatari Prime Minister.
2 million Israelis
Mitchell, we're also seeing the Qatar.
2 million Israelis are celebrating Ramadan. But let me tell you something. For Palestinian Muslims, part of their religion was killing Jewish people. And 1,500 Israelis, the last words they heard before they were killed was Allah Akbar. Was Allah Akbar. So it's become part of the religious worship of Palestinian Muslims is to kill infidels. So we don't know, is the Ramadan of the killing of the Israeli Jewish infidels going to be what we see? Or is this going to be the peaceful Ramadan that hundreds of millions of Muslims celebrate? And it doesn't have to do with the Israeli army or access to Al-Aqsa. It has to do with incitement.
Right. We can keep talking over each other. We can keep talking over each other, sir. But I do not listen to Israeli officials say that they want to take Gaza off the map. Excuse me. I don't use that as an excuse to say that all Jews want to kill all Muslims or all Israelis want to kill all Muslims. Let's please not stereotype and let's please not generalize. These are incredibly inflammatory statements that you're making. We can all talk about the policies without putting an entire religion at fault for anything that's happening right now, because that is incredibly dangerous and incredibly simplistic.
Israelis. For 1,500 Israelis, the last words that they heard before they were killed was Allah Akbar. So I don't know if it's those Palestinian Muslims that are going to celebrate Ramadan by igniting the region, or it's going to be the hundreds of millions that are the peaceful ones. But for the Hamas and the Hezbollah, which means party of God.
We're almost out of time. I'm going to put it to you.
Israel,
or
for the Islamic
Gil Miheli.
We don't know that.
All right, we're almost out of time. Gil Miheli.
No, I just wanted to remind everyone that after 1967, contrary to the Jordanian policy, Israel gave access to the holy places to Christians and especially to Muslims, and that Palestinians didn't need provocation in order to transform Jerusalem into a political dynamite. Doesn't mean that there are no provocations.
My question was,
today.
how do you find on the eve of this Ramadan common ground at this point?
I have no idea. I just know that everything we hear on the media about pessimism and optimism is manipulation. We don't know what's going on within the places where they are negotiating.
And they're negotiating in Cairo and in Washington and other places that we don't know about. Gil Miheli, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Jasmine Al-Gamal for being with us. Tahani Mustafa, Mitchell Barak, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.